Amazing. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from. I see people hopping into the chat here, which is awesome. Everyone is rolling in. Welcome to Securing Budget for Internal Comms in a Down Market. As per usual, we're going to give everyone a couple minutes just to kind of pop into the chat and maybe get their lunch, their coffee, whatever they may be doing. In the meantime, feel free to write in the chat where you're tuning in from and maybe how you heard about today's webinar. Dina coming in from Toronto. We see Dorothy, Jennifer, Joseph, Lee, Michelle, Ray, Mary. Lots of people coming in. Waterloo, good to see fellow Ontario,
Nice.
Portugal.
It's always cool to see international. We try to time these so that we can get the most time zone coverage, but it's really tough to pick a time that works for everyone.
It's a nice time for me. It's
Good.
4 o'clock. It's good.
Perfect.
Oh, California, even on the West Coast as well. Yeah, that's what I mean. You have to kind of pick this sweet spot where people are waking up with their coffee, they're either eating their lunch or maybe they're just about to log off for the day, but we catch them at the tail end. And I'm sure lots of you are grabbing this as a recording as well. So you might be watching this after the date, but we're on June 4th, 11 o'clock Eastern here. My name's Tyler, excited to host you for Securing Budget for an Internal Comms in a Down Market. Once again, just one more minute for those last minute people to pop into the chat. While you're waiting, feel free to throw in where you're tuning in from, maybe how you heard about today's webinar, and we'll be getting started shortly in about 30 seconds or so. Perfect. Okay, I've seen a few more come in. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. It's ContactMonkey and Appspace today, putting on securing budget for an internal comms in a down market, data-powered strategies for showing the value of internal comms and getting that ever so difficult leadership buy-in. Today we have myself, who is just going to be hosting and taking your questions. Then we have Tara Robertson, the Director of Marketing at ContactMonkey. Tara has 12 years of experience in B2B SaaS and excels at crafting creative, cost-effective strategies that resonate with audiences. Great at scalable growth, brand storytelling, and the evolving landscape of internal communications. Right beside her, we have Dave Fletcher, the VP of Workplace Comm Strategy at Appspace. Dave is a seasoned comm strategist who helps organizations thrive in the digital workplace solutions. He leads sales, retention, and growth across the EMEA region. And Dave regularly speaks on the future of internal comms, from async collaboration to omni creation. I'll pass it over to you two and look forward to the thoughtful discussion.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ty. We need to get a nicer bio for you next time so we can give you some praises as well. So just a really quick look at our agenda for today. So we'll be talking about some industry trends and insights that we've seen from both Appspace and ContactMonkey, some common communication goals and challenges that we've both run into, how to address these at the strategy and leadership level. We'll make some time for Q&A, so save your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and we'll be addressing those later. And of course, this is being recorded, so no need to take notes or anything, and we'll also share around our reports afterwards for anyone who wants to dive a little bit deeper. Alrighty, so I know we have a couple of ContactMonkey customers joining us, probably a few from Appspace as well. So you might be wondering why we're partnering today. So while our platforms don't directly integrate, they're highly complementary. So this partnership is bringing together ContactMonkey's expertise in the internal email comm space and Appspace's strengths in workplace experience. So we're really committed to helping our customers reach employees wherever they are with that consistent and impactful messaging that we know can be really tough for internal comms folks to nail down. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, I really wanted to highlight some recent research that we've been keeping an eye on here at ContactMonkey. So obviously, disengagement is a big trending topic right now, but it's really turning into more of a systemic issue. Sometimes people like to dismiss it as kind of a soft issue that doesn't impact the bottom line. And they kind of have it as something that HR should handle kind of off the side of their desk. But what we're seeing in the headlines and in the data that we'll get to later is really that this is not an isolated issue. You can see it's definitely global. It's all over the place right now, and it is systemic. So it touches everything from performance, productivity, mental health of your employees, leadership trust, can damper team dynamics, and all of that really impacts your business results at the end of the day, which is something that leadership should be concerned about. And obviously that disengagement has real financial and cultural costs for your company. So financially, disengaged employees can be less productive, are more likely to leave, and we know that how expensive it can be to replace those employees. And culturally, it can create some resentment and erode trust, which can be really tough, especially if you're in a hybrid, remote environment. It's tough to build that back up remotely.
I think that's one of the things we're trying to achieve, right? I mean, every day I get asked about ROI, and it's very difficult, right? Employee experience is very
Very.
difficult to put a tangible number on. And I think this is looking at the studies and the statistics we have. This hopefully helps everyone watching or attending the call to have that conversation with a bit more armory, should we say.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sure you saw, Dave, but Gallup put out a report just a couple months ago, and that declining employee engagement, their rough estimate for how much it's impacted the global economy is around 438 billion in lost productivity. So when you see that number, it's a little jarring.
Sobering.
And yeah, sobering is a great word for that. So what can you do about it? That's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to share a ton of data in this presentation. Again, it is recorded, no need to take notes. But I wanted to take a step back and show you where this data is coming from. So every year, ContactMonkey surveys around 450 internal communicators from over 400 organizations across the globe to put together our global state of internal comms. And what our report is really focused on is the individual contributors that are really owning that work and owning that internal comms for their companies. So a lot of you joining us today are probably in that same boat. And Dave, did you want to speak to the Appspace report really quickly?
Yeah, so we've been doing this for the last few years, and I think one of the things we look at is Appspace. When we deliver products, we don't just build for the buyer. Of course, we do build for the buyer, but we also build for the end user. And what we decided to do a few years back was talk to the end user, talk to the employees of these organizations, and try to understand what are their challenges, and do the two marry? Because often we expect the two to marry, the internal communication challenges and the employee challenges, but really diving into the statistics and looking at whether or not where the gaps are has proved to be very successful for us. So we did it in late 2023, I think, and then again in 2025. And luckily, we have the ability to kind of cross-reference the data as well and see where the changes happen. But yeah, it's a report that's definitely getting a lot of good traction for us.
Great. Yeah, seeing those year-over-year trends is the most interesting part to me of these types of reports, because the number on its own doesn't say too much, but when you can see how it was last year, it can really paint the full picture. So just to kick off from our side, one thing that we asked internal comms folks about is just the size of their team. So a lot of you won't be surprised to see the small numbers on this slide, that you're tasked with a lot of responsibility especially at a large company. But internal comms teams remain lean. We've seen this in the last few years. And that gap between the expectations on you and the resources that you have available, not just people, but we'll get into budget later, it can be really tough when we think about how broad the changes are in the market. So over 60% of internal comms folks are working on teams with 5 people or less, which is pretty tough to get a lot done. And 1 in 5 are just a team of 1. So a single person comms team who's really responsible for engaging an entire company's workforce, which can be, again, in person, remote, hybrid. Sometimes you have frontline workers who are not even on laptops day to day, and it's your job to try to engage with those folks, which is really tough. And on our side, so this one, the numbers haven't changed too much in the last year. So we saw the slight uptick in the 2 to 5 person teams, only up by around 3%, but most of these team sizes did not have much of a change year over year. One thing that I did want to highlight here that is concerning, and again, this is a survey of people interested in internal comms, is that 12% of the people that we surveyed did not have an official internal comms function. So this is people doing it kind of off the side of their desk. They're asked to help and kind of chip in, but there isn't really an owner of internal comms. So I see folks are just constantly being asked to do more with less, sometimes even without that being their full-time role.
And often the correlation between the largest organizations is not what you'd expect. We have some customers that have the 20 plus people team, but we have other customers that have 100,000 employees and a team of 3. So there's not always the correlation you'd expect, the size of organization versus the number of internal comms teams.
And it's a ton of responsibility. So even like we saw this during COVID, all of a sudden a one-person team was responsible for communicating to 100,000 people, hey, please don't come into the office because there's this
Yeah.
thing that we're scared of, right? So that crisis comms can really highlight some of the challenges there for sure. Another question that we asked was around just market factors and team sizes. So again, we seen this word inflation a lot, but I think if we did this survey again now, it would be quite different. This was numbers from back in January. So probably need to redo this in a couple months and see because things have changed quite a bit. But overall recession fears we saw were up 13% year over year, and people were either scared of layoffs or had experienced them much higher than we were seeing in the previous year, which isn't much of a surprise to most of us on this call. So that's really just that kind of pressure cooker of uncertainty is impacting people a lot. And it's usually on internal comms folks to not only communicate these changes, but often they're the teams being impacted as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword for a lot of internal comms folks, which is really tough.
And this doesn't really, I mean, without showing my age, every time that there's any kind of environment like this, it's the malaise that hits you first. It's not the we're not doing it, we are doing it. It's that we just don't know. We just don't know. Let's delay. Let's delay. And I've seen that a few times in the last however many years. But yeah, it definitely impacts the internal comms team before anyone else, I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, they often know about the bad news first, which is a tough spot to be. It can be
Yeah.
probably a lonely spot, I imagine, too. So a few other things I just want to call out first before I get into this. Again, if we did the survey today, I think this would be quite different. I imagine AI would be at the top, and probably change management as well would be up there on this list. But when we ran this survey, 42% of comms folks that we spoke to said that their employee experience was, or sorry, 68% said that their employee experience was the top topic that they were paying most attention to. And obviously, that's tough to control as a team of one or two or three. Um, but a lot of teams here were also just worried about things like employee recognition, which again, if you're an IC person, it's often on you to communicate things like employee recognition, but you're not necessarily deciding things like comp plans and how people actually get recognized day to day.
Great. So we'll talk about our report as we go through the rest of the session, but obviously the Appspace report looks at the employee experience. And before I kind of give you some stats from our report, I want to give you a stat that I found. It wasn't even from us, it was a Financial Times report that I read. I was waiting to board a plane, and for anyone who's ever been through Heathrow Airport, you get a free Financial Times near the gate. And I was sitting there thumbing through it, and there was a stat in there that basically said, what do employees want? And it was a whole report about the employee experience and what do our users, our employees want. And surprise, surprise, number one was salary. No surprise whatsoever. But number two did surprise me because the statistic that it gave us was it said 40% of workers would take a pay cut of 5% or more to retain the flexibility they perceived to have during COVID. So flexibility, the ability to have the experience they want was what they valued above all else except for salary. And then a further 9% of them would trade up to 20% of their salary just to have that level of flexibility to work how they want. Now they're big numbers. When people are talking about literally giving away money so that they can work or have the experience that they want when they come to the office, really, yeah, made me kind of take. It was just before I was about to give a speech about this, so it was a really timely stat that I read. But I think when we look at our report and we break it down as we go through, 85% of employees believe that there's room to grow. But the good news is that over 80% want better, right? They actually want comms. It's not like maybe 10 years ago when people would say, why do I care? Why do I want to read that? Now people do. They want to understand the culture, the mission, the desires of the organization and have a cohesive messaging that makes sense. And of course, that directly correlates with the culture or the perceived culture. I've worked with organizations that do amazing things that have a high turnover because they cannot get their messaging across to the users. But I've also worked with companies that have, had questionable pasts or bad press that have really low turnover because they understand how to communicate and get the message across to the employees of what they're trying to achieve, where they're trying to go. So there is a huge correlation between employee experience, culture, and retention. And obviously we'll dive into that a bit more as we go through.
Mm. Yeah, that flexibility is so interesting to me because I feel like early COVID, people were excited, and then some of us kind of got sick of like too much alone time. Maybe that was just me. And now it's kind of circling back around to people miss that
No,
flexibility. So it's interesting to see the trade-offs people are
it
willing.
is, but I think it's kind of like it's not necessarily the flexibility. We've got some, huge customers that prioritize the physical workplace. So making sure that when they
Mhm.
went in, it was the best experience that it could be, that it was healthy. They were monitoring CO2 levels in meeting rooms and allowing you to get the messages on screens as you walk past, like really, really making it a great place to be and work. And for them, it was, well, how do I get a desk? How do I know who's going to be in the office? How do I make sure that I have got a space? So I think what our users want is not necessarily the ability to stay from home. I think it's more just the flexibility to do what works for them. And like you said, Tara, the ability to go into the office when I want to go into the office and meet people and get a real human connection. And I think that's what we find is that people want the flexibility to make that choice in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Alrighty, so moving on to, we've highlighted where our report data comes from, but moving on to some of the challenges that we're seeing across both our teams with internal comms folks. So there's a couple blockers that we're seeing in terms of just challenges for internal comms in general. The biggest one that comes up for us year over year is tracking and measuring internal comms, which isn't a huge surprise from the folks that I speak with. It's kind of an ongoing battle of trying to get out of just the day-to-day communications and work to taking a kind of a higher step up and thinking, how can we measure this? How can we improve it? Newsletter over newsletter or comms over comms. And then again, that communication across departments is a huge challenge, especially as we've spoken, some companies are remote, hybrid, in person, and sometimes it just starts at the leadership level that there just isn't the best kind of track record for keeping teams communicated. So there's often a lot of challenges around getting that consistency, whether it's owned by marketing, owned by HR, owned by IT. It really depends company to company who owns that cross-functional communication. Other tough challenges for internal comms folks that we've seen are just low employee responsiveness. So even if you put the best email together for your team, you often just don't hear back. And that can be tough when it just goes into a black hole. You can see that people are opening it, but a lot of times that's about it. And that can be even worse again if you're communicating with remote or hybrid teams because you're not getting that feedback when you're making a coffee or when you're in the kitchen at lunch the way that a lot of in-person teams do. So really just the takeaway from this one for me is that I see folks shouldn't just be creating content and kind of throwing it out into the ether and hoping that it lands, but you need to be a little bit more strategic. And a lot of the time to do that, you just need better tools and clearer data. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Again, going back to this measurement piece. So what's getting in the way for measuring? So a lot of internal comms folks, around 68%, if I add this up, said yes, they agree or strongly agree that things are getting worse, not better. So we're actually seeing 4% up year over year are agreeing that it's very difficult to showcase the impact of their work internally. So obviously this is something we'd love to fix at ContactMonkey, but we're noticing as we survey that this seems to be getting worse every year, and that gap is really growing. And this really just comes back to measurement. So if you can't measure your internal comms, you can't improve. And you kind of need a baseline to be able to track these things. And that will help you get not just budget, but also buy-in and influence at the leadership level. If you can show, hey, we're improving every time we send something to the whole company, here's the engagement rates, here's how it's trending. And that can also help with things like resource allocation. So if you're a team of one, but your newsletters are consistently doing better and performing, getting more engagement every single time, that's something that you could build off of potentially. So really some of the foundational gaps here are all around, again, tracking that impact. I always like to say, and I think this is kind of a cheesy thing that marketers say, but you can't improve what you can't measure. So if you don't know where you're at today, it's really tough to make those changes and get more improvements on your comms. So really you have to look into the tools that are available and see what you can do to track that. And often that might involve a bit of budget. Maybe it's just something that you need to start small, prove that you can scale things, but we know it's not lack of effort. I see folks work very hard. It's just usually lack of resources and budget.
Excellent. So there was three stories I wanted to tell there in your slides, but I thought I'll save them for my slides because then
Oh, sure.
I've already teed
Whenever
it
it
up.
makes
But
sense.
they're about customers, you see. So yeah, I think the first one, and I always like to do this, but anyone on the call, anyone who's attending, put in the chat for me how many separate comms tools you're managing today. Just a number, right? One if it's just email, or two if it's your email and your intranet, or three or four or five, or because it's always interesting to see how many tools do you have to manage as a comms professional. And the record I have, by the way, is 13. So if you beat 13 and you're managing more than 13 tools, then you're doing well. You're struggling,
I
I
thought you said
imagine.
30, 30.
13, 13. Maybe
That's
there's
not as
more out
bad.
there. I don't know. But I think, technology is supposed to help, and it's not. It's giving us more challenges as comms teams, as IT teams. So how do we basically cater for all of these different audiences that we have using these different tools? And I remember sitting down with a customer once, and it goes back to the slide that you just showed there, Tara, and you mentioned about, unless we know who's reading what, unless we have the data, unless we have the metrics. And there's a customer that showed me they had a must-read feature in their intranet, and they wanted to replace their intranet with the tool that we were working with, and we showed them the solution. And I said, okay, show me the must-read feature. And this guy was super proud of it. And I think he had something like 38 must-read messages that he hadn't read. So the must-read message kind of got lost in amongst all the rest of the noise. And I think when we look at how do we communicate with our employees, there's a couple of mantras from the consumer world that we can lean on. So for example, I think and you probably know this better than me, but in marketing, there's a rule of seven, right? You have to see content at least 7 times before it kind of sinks in or before you become a buyer. Now, obviously, we're not trying to sell to our end users, but similar rules apply. How do we get that messaging across? How do we reiterate? And how do we use all the different channels available to do so? And then there's a statistic, or a quote, sorry, from a famous Irish playwright and a political activist called George Bernard Shaw, or just known as Bernard Shaw. And it was, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So thinking that you've communicated but not knowing is 90% of the battle. And of course, the statistics that we have from our report show that around 26 employees are satisfied with the company's workplace tools and technologies. That's not necessarily the message they're getting. It's the way they're getting it amongst all the different plethora of devices and tools that they have to navigate.
Wow, that's a shocking number, 26%. There's a lot of room for improvement there.
There it is. But luckily people want it, right? That's the good news.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying earlier, it's not that people don't want to be in an office, but they want to know what's going on. They want to know, am I going to have a desk? Am I going to have a safe environment with the CO2 levels? So just that communication.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So lastly, we'll tie this all back up to the leadership level. So once you have all these stats, you know how to make the case for what channels you need to focus on, but how do you bring this to your leadership team and communicate this all effectively? So this hopefully, I mean, not hopefully, but it probably isn't a surprise to a lot of you here, but more than half of IC teams that we speak with do not have a fixed budget. So when they do find something that they need, or say it's headcount, say it's a tool that they really like, they're often starting from scratch and trying to build a use case story for that for their leadership team. It's not something that has a line item for budget every year. So very different than some of us in marketing, but still a ton of responsibility and a lot they have to get done. The good thing that we did see here is that there are some trends on the lower end. So some there's some movement here.
You're finding positives. I like it.
Yeah, trying to find the positives here. It's a little tough on this one. But an interesting thing is why this matters is that you can't be strategic if you're always reactionary. And a lot of the time that's what happens to IC folks is it's, oh, hey, there's this new AI thing and we need a company policy around AI. Can you take care of it? So if you're jumping on things like that without a real plan, it can be really tough to plan ahead and be strategic and to take the time to really build out that roadmap of here's what we would love our comms to look like 6 months, a year from now. And without tools that can help you, say, get that content onto a calendar, get that all planned out, organized for you, it's really tough to see and plan ahead. So one thing that we've like to say sometimes at ContactMonkey is that budget can often be that thing that turns internal comms from that reactive role into a strategic role because you have tools at your disposal that you can use to plan ahead and get ahead of these things.
And like we said at the start, I think more and more, and I've seen customers do this, they're able to show how a little investment can have huge savings. And obviously that, that's what we're trying to do here. But this, the do more with less is still very much prevalent across the industry. but now
Mhm.
you're getting the ability. And I literally had this week where a customer showed us the amount of money that they would save if they moved. And that is when a
Mm.
customer does that and shows you that, that's brilliant. It does the job for us effectively.
Yeah, and there's so many things now, especially with tools like ours adding AI that can save you time. So it's not always necessarily saving a budget line item, but if I can save an IC person, say 10 hours a week that they were putting together a newsletter, then that's something that you could bring back to your leadership team and make that case.
Absolutely.
So again, kind of going back to a lot of IC teams being reactive, it's often clear what leadership team priorities are at the company level. It's when they, at least when they say it to IC teams, it's usually, hey, we want higher productivity from our employees. We want to increase employee engagement. And we want you to keep an eye on company culture and strengthen that when you can. So those are three very broad things that are very hard to impact in the short term. So it's really tough when we're seeing that 56% of internal comms folks do not have a long-term strategy, but they're being asked to tackle these quite massive company priorities. And this is really tough because obviously it's a company-wide impact, but it's kind of setting the IC team up to fail because if you don't have a strategy, again, you're just reactionary, you're jumping on trends and trying to tackle things as they come, but you really need to be thinking longer term to have meaningful impact on broad things like employee engagement and company culture.
Great. So for me, as I said before, I get asked the question, every day almost, how do we calculate ROI? How do we get a return on investment in these tools? And often the question almost needs to be flipped. It's more, well, what is the cost of not doing it? Or what is the cost
Mhm.
of, what are the ramifications further down the line? And I've got a couple of examples, but there was one a customer I spoke to about 2 years ago, and their turnover of their frontline staff was literally, it was nearly 100%. Like it was ridiculous amounts of turnover. And then they went into the HR stats and they looked at how much it would take to hire each person, to train them, to onboard them, to go through the whole process. And straight away you're starting to look at savings. But it's not just top-down communication that is the problem when we look at employee experience. Employee experience is a wide gamut, right? It's the experience. It's not just the way that we communicate with them. And often you hear customers or users say that it's actually collaboration's a problem as well. And I see this day in, day out. Nearly every organization that we have as a customer, not all, but a huge majority, has Microsoft, and they might use Teams. But then again, those frontline workers, they're not going to go and buy a Teams license for them, particularly if the turnover is so high. So how are they going to get that kind of synchronous based communication? And then talking of Teams, and I love Teams, I'm not picking on it here, but Teams, for example, has the ability to have focusing, right? So you can change the logo and put I'm focusing, but focusing is the same as do not disturb. So people see the logo and just go, oh, he's just focusing. I'll just ping him and see what he's up to. I wonder if he can help me.
Mm.
And I think little things like this that we've rolled out again, as we talked about COVID before, but some organizations went from no chat-based solution, whether it's Slack or Teams or whatever it might be, or no async solution, to everyone having access overnight, or everyone with a desk, and then the frontline
Mhm.
not. And again, it's created more and more of these silos. It's created more and more of these collaboration kind of mismatches. And then you've got companies that have acquisitions, that Google and Microsoft, or the two worlds together. So employees are often disconnected because they don't know what the truth is, and they don't know which tool is the right one to go through. And I think the worrying stat here is that, yes, okay, 82% struggle to connect and collaborate effectively, and that hasn't massively changed since last year for us. But I think that
Hmm.
when we think that our organizations are actively not trying to improve is the worry. And of course, when you look at the numbers, then the last stat here, that the cost of replacing an employee can be to 1.5 or 2 times the employee's annual salary. And that's a huge cost if you have a very low attrition rate, and you can't keep the staff that you have or the skilled people that you have, then ultimately it causes a huge expense. So looking at ROI is difficult, but turn it the other way, and what is the tangible cost of not doing this, I think is a lot easier to understand.
Yeah, I love this perspective on the employee side of things because we often hear, oh, I wish people would just tell me how they feel. I wish they would respond to my emails, but you're just going and asking them. So it's super useful to have these stats.
Yeah, it is. and
Mhm.
and really on the next slide, I think when we look at what do the employees want, it's pretty basic. I mean, it's basic
Mhm.
in the context of what we think they would want, right? So consistent communication, that's obvious. We don't want different messagings for different countries, but then there are nuances, of course, because in Germany, you have to behave differently than the US, or in the UK, we have a different tone of voice from Kuala Lumpur, for example. So global organizations struggle a lot with the idea of consistent communication, but also culture, and sometimes languages. We have customers, very huge retail customers that you probably think who I mean, but their slogans in some languages don't necessarily translate that well. They can seem a little
Mm.
bit offensive almost, or warmongery, I think is the term they used. So how do you take and soften that to multiple languages? And then how do you give access to all of that content? Because again, if we've got that frontline worker who doesn't have a Microsoft license, a Teams license, a SharePoint license, and we've got a SharePoint-based intranet, how are we going to reach them? And we haven't got a corporate email address for them. They don't even have Outlook. So how do we get that newsletter to them? And of course, most users don't like change. So, if you've lived your life in Teams and someone says, I want you to go to the intranet to consume your content, you're going to say, no, I don't. I'm going to go in Teams. My father worked for IBM for many years. He's an old school database administrator. And I remember someone telling him he had to use social. Well, this was like 15, 20 years ago now, before he retired. And he was like, no, I'm not using social. No, no chance, right? So people don't like necessarily to change. So giving them the content in their own digital front door is also key. And then ultimately giving all the users the same messaging, the same tools, and albeit that's often very, very difficult, can foster this sense of connection. And I think when we show this to customers, when we sit down with them and say, this is what your employees want, we hear a set of challenges back from the customer, and rightly so. The first one I hear in my job every day is, yeah, but IT won't let us move away from SharePoint. Like, no matter how much we want to, we can't move away from SharePoint. Or, well, we've got this tool over here, and sorry to pick on WordPress, but if you've ever used WordPress, I don't know how to use it. Right? There's too many add-ons and too many templates, and I'm not going to go and create content over there. Or, well, yeah, we have AI. In fact, I ask this question to every customer: do you use AI today? And no one ever says yes or no. Everyone says, well, in this part of the business we do, but in this part we don't. And in this part we're piloting Copilot, but not over here. So again, this idea of these different levels of who uses what. And then a more recent one that I've heard, which I haven't heard before until about 6 months ago, was stuff appears in the news feed and then disappears and we don't know how to find it again. And that's because some tools are being very clever, using algorithms to make stuff hide once it's been read, which is great. But we discussed before the rule of 7. So how do you get a message across if it disappears once you've clicked on it, for example? So I think this all really tees up when we're talking to customers how we're trying to solve that space, and of course, together with yourselves. And if you go into the next slide, this is a bit of a convoluted one, but this is what we think is something that a lot of it doesn't have to be Appspace, right? Customers can do this regardless, but it's coming up with a strategy of what are the tools you have, because I think you have to understand that, and then understanding how to plug those data sources in and redistribute them. Because if you create content once and publish it everywhere, that's just good old-fashioned spam, right? That's not necessarily multi-channel or, as we call it, orchestration. The idea really is, again, like we discussed before, using the data, understanding the metrics, and knowing where people consume content and reaching them with that content, regardless of where that content's created. Whether you've got that one guy in IT who likes creating content in SharePoint. No one likes creating content in SharePoint. But if there's the one guy who does, then great, he can. That's fine. Or unlike myself, if you know how to use WordPress and you're very, au fait with it, or Umbraco, or whatever the CMS is, how do we distribute that content to email? How do we reach those people on digital sign? How do we reach those people in Microsoft, in SharePoint? So it's about taking multiple data sources and making it accessible to everyone where they are, regardless of whether or not they're a frontline worker with a license or not. And this has been a big investment for us, but it's also been very successful when we start to look at some of the challenges our customers would have with managing these multiple silos, these multiple tools.
Yeah, and I love your point on orchestration, because one thing I've noticed here, I've only been at ContactMonkey for 3 months, so still getting up to speed. But one thing that's interesting is obviously we use our own platform for our internal newsletter. And it's really, people are looking for that consistency. So now at first we had to remind people, like, go check the newsletter, like go back and look at it. And you have to meet people in the channels where they are, of course, but you have to also do that consistently. So if people know the last Wednesday of every month is when I'm going to get this newsletter, then maybe I'll save my questions and wait and review it. And so it's kind of training the team to have that expectation from your internal comms as well.
Exactly. And in the limited experience I've had with newsletters, albeit obviously with yourselves recently, one of the things I struggle with, I'm not particularly organized as a general person, and I use my email for a lot of things, and I'll search for something, and if I have an email newsletter from 3 different emails, I can't find it. Like it has to be from the same
Same.
person or
Yeah.
the same
Hmm.
address, has to have the same kind of tone, the same context, and of course not get caught by spam. So yeah, again, that consistency is especially for someone who's not that organized, it's key.
I don't think you're alone on that.
Oh, good,
Yeah.
good.
Mm.
Okay, is this you or me? I've missed this me. Apologies. Investing in the right
This
tech.
one's you,
Okay,
but
so
I can
it
wait
is.
later.
It is. So this one, I think, when we look at orchestration and we talk to our
Mm,
customers and we say, okay, how do you do that? I think you have to kind of work backwards. And again, a story I have from about 7 years ago now, I think. I remember sitting down with a UK police force. I'm not going to name them for obvious reasons, but I sat down with them and discussed the channels they had. And one of them was WhatsApp. Now, WhatsApp's not massive in North America, but in Europe, everybody
mm,
uses WhatsApp. And it's not a great tool to use to discuss crime. And this particular police department were discussing crimes in this tool that was absolutely not authorized by the organization, that was not something that was governed. So I think understanding the tools that you have first and then deciding which ones to bring together, which ones to consolidate is key. Because you might have, and we haven't used the word shadow IT for many years, but effectively that's what it is. It's tools that are unsanctioned, and now more
mhm,
than ever, it's easier to do. I mean, there's so many tools out there, and IT teams have a harder job than ever trying to govern and kind of manage them all. But you also
mhm,
don't want to put too much friction in. There's nothing worse than trying to use that AI tool to help you do your job and be told, no, you don't have a license, right? So again, that balance is key. And then, like we discussed before, but allowing users to have their own digital front door. And that's a Gartner term, the digital front door. But effectively, where is it they want to get content? Is it email? That's okay. Is it Teams? That's fine. Is it SharePoint? That's okay. So again, how do we reach those users? Or is it the big screen as you walk through the lobby that you can scan the QR code and interact? Or in my case, because again, I'm not overly organized and I'm time poor, I listen. So I take the kids to school. I'll listen to my editorialized content from Appspace
mhm,
internally via an audio generated podcast for me that our platform automatically does. It creates a kind of summary or a digest of all of the stories, the pages, the editorialized content for me, and then I can listen to it as I'm taking the kids to school. So I think giving them
mhm,
the front door they want is key to a successful commerce strategy. And hopefully end result is you also reduce costs because you don't need to go and support that WordPress add-on that costs you X number a year, or you don't need to
mhm,
have 5 SharePoint developers, or you don't need to, pay for licenses for those frontline workers who don't necessarily need that Teams or that Outlook license. And
mm,
then lastly, this has been a theme all the way through, but understand what your users are doing. Like data has never been more important, and now we all have the world's biggest superpower in generative AI to understand data, right? It can quite literally make recommendations based on mass amounts of data that we would never have the time or the foresight to look through and start to make those recommendations. I did a demo last week where I asked our AI, why are these 3 channels not being read? And the
mm,
feedback was there's not enough images in the stories. People like images, particularly of themselves. So again, understanding how and where when that data is being consumed and making recommendations. We live in an era where this is completely possible. So there's no excuse now to not understand that data, I think.
mm. Yeah, that's one area I'm super excited about for the future of where AI will help us out is in that kind of interpreting data, making recommendations of, hey, 10 people didn't open this email, so you should send it again at X time, or you should change the subject line next time. Just those little tweaks that I think you just don't get to, especially when you're running from task to task. So,
Absolutely. And I read an article literally, I think it was on Sunday, and it was a guy who started a business and basically prompted, I think it was ChatGPT, but he prompted generative AI to put up a business plan and highlight the weaknesses of all the 4 competitors, and he listed them. And the
hmm,
depth this report went into, like it
mm,
understood all the data that was out there on the web and came back and gave him a recommendation. I think, as you say, yeah, it's a super exciting field, and taking it a step further and start to be preemptive with it is where I'm excited. Understanding the data and giving the metrics, but making that recommendation to the comms person as they're real-time writing or as they're
hmm,
about to hit
yeah.
send. Hey, push this to a screen or push your email newsletter out an hour earlier. You're going to get a bump in readership. That for me
Hmm.
is what we're very excited about at Appspace, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, super exciting.
And of course, this is it. I mean, the data-driven tactics. So there is no such thing as a complete employee experience, right? It's a never-ending journey. And I've been helping to build intranets, or been part of intranets and comms tools and uh, intelligent workplaces, digital workplaces, ESNs. The terminology has changed a lot over the years, but effectively, the one consistent is they're never finished. You've always got to strive to improve, and common strategies are the same. Understanding where, when, and how those users consume that content, and then making sure that you shift, change, adapt, and facilitate so that those users can get it as their. We have a customer that's a large mining firm, and they can reach those users on the bus on the way to the mine, via a screen on the bus, because that proved to be a successful one. And I remember speaking to a healthcare organization that said that their most read content was on a screen on the back of the toilet door in the cubicle. Again, understanding that and using that data is key to success, I think.
That's a smart one. Yeah, and then just to tie this all back to, if you can find some real links to things like adoption of new initiatives to tie back your comms to. So for example, if that ad on the back of the toilet stall was something about downloading the latest version of your internal app, then that would be
It's
a
a good
great way
one.
to tie it. You could definitely catch very captive audience, so you can catch them when they're waiting. But there's a lot of other opportunities that you can tie that back to. Oh, I skipped ahead, sorry. So really just to tie this whole conversation together, it's definitely not a great market right now overall. I think we all know that. We've acknowledged that. But smart leaders aren't just looking to cut costs across the board. They're also looking to reduce risk and retain top talent. It's a really, even though it is a rough market, your top talent is always, people are always reaching out to them. I know from experience, the best people on the team are constantly getting messages elsewhere, even though it is a rough market. So you really want to retain those top people. And that's really a key way that internal comms can help. And investing in internal comms earlier on means fewer misunderstandings, higher productivity, more connected, and really just engaged workforce. So people have more reason to stay and grow with your company.
Absolutely.
And of course, I'll share these links to our full reports in the follow-up where we send the recording, so you can take a closer dive. They're quite lengthy, so we didn't want to recap everything here, but we tried to cover all of the highlights. So we'll share that for anyone who wants to take a closer dive.
Absolutely. And if you want to contact us directly as well, any questions, then please feel free to do so.
Great. Yeah, I'll put our LinkedIn links in that follow-up if that works for you, Dave.
Great. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Great.
Awesome. Well, great conversation, Tara and Dave. Thank you for that. I'll give everyone a minute or so to think of any questions, anything that came to mind over that conversation. You can throw it in the chat here or the Q&A. The chat is probably okay. And we can ask it to our two panelists here. But yeah, I loved hearing everything about reactionary and how you're kind of just trying to keep your head above water if you don't have that strategy in place ahead of time. Dave, some great points about the employee turnover and how expensive that cost is. And I think in internal comms, you really need to lean on that when going back to senior leadership, because you can't tie it exactly internal comms to revenue, but you can talk and tie it to those employee costs and those that are disengaged. Super cool that you have that podcast ability as well.
It's cool,
That
Jeff.
listens
Yeah,
in.
that's
I
super smart.
can't text and drive or anything, so you have to think about it. Okay? And that's a good way, is just to listen to content rather than read it. While we wait for see if anyone has a question in the chat, I did have one myself. Is how are other internal comms folks using AI in their day-to-day? I know AI is, such a buzzword these days. So do either of you have experience with how kind of the people we're chatting to online right now, internal comms, are using AI in their roles?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can go.
I have a
Oh, sorry,
few.
go ahead.
You want to go first, Tara? No, after you. After you.
Sure, I have a quick
Ladies
one.
first.
So one thing that I've seen folks use it for is translating. So obviously translation can be, especially for internal comms, you want to be really careful with translation because the tone is super important. But AI is one way translating automatically is something that you can do. And now we have that within ContactMonkey, which is very cool. And then also just recapping and shortening copy. AI can be
Yep.
super helpful at cutting out the fluff because I think a lot of the time we're too close to it. And so it can help cut through the noise there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those completely agree. And generative AI translations are so much better than anything we've had before. Like they really do get those nuances we talked about before. So we've got quite a lot of AI in the platform, and there's been a few surprises for me because we've rolled it out to customers and we've asked for feedback. One of them, which I think we didn't see until until we saw it, of course. But when you're using it for content creation, which we've all tried, right? We've all asked to write a story or an email or whatever it might be. And also image creation as well. Image creation has been a big one for us. A lot of our customers are using it to create images based on the body of text that they've written. But I think one of the things we got was, well, you need to be able to contextualize that AI. So a number of our customers, when we released that feature, went in and prompted the AI in the back end of our solution to say, you work for company X, this is your tone of voice, we are informal here, we do this, this, this. And then next time the content was created, or next time the image was created, it had a memory. And I think that was a big win for us, seeing customers pushing us to do that. But the other one is the audio digest. We have the statistics of how many people are using it, and 24% of content in the last 3 months was listened to as opposed to read, which is a pretty high number when you consider that, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily automatically do that. And then the last one is more of a pain point that I think we've seen with customers is in the UK or in Europe, we have this thing called WCAG, which in the US is Section 508. It's the idea of accessibility, so making things work with screen readers for people with disabilities. And there's small things that any comms team can do. So, for example, alt text, the ability to add alt text or gradation of images. No one knows what alt text is. So your tool might support alt text, but most people creating content, particularly if you disseminate responsibility, they don't know how to use alt text. So AI can create that alt text for you. It can create image descriptions. It can do things that will remove barriers to participation for people with disabilities. So I think little things like that humans have been left to do that sometimes get forgotten, AI can kind of step in and help remove the tasks.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's smart. It's not
I
the
love
most
that.
exciting creative work too, writing alt text. So it's a fun thing
No,
to
it's
just
super boring.
offload to someone else. Yeah.
That's a great
And
thing to pass
often
off.
Gen AI is too wordy, right? So you have to go in and manipulate it, but still, it's a good starting point. So you now know what alt text is because someone's done it for you first time. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great thing to pass off, and I love AI cutting out the fluff as well, where AI won't show any mercy for sure. So it's easy to let that do the bad job. I did get a question here sent to me on DM anonymously. They're feeling, like they're having trouble, I guess, bringing it up to their boss and trying to get budget, for ROI. It's hard to prove ROI kind of in the internal comms field. How would you best approach your boss, and like what can you take to your boss, I guess, to kind of prove that ROI and kind of have a strong case when asking for budget?
All right, that's you, I think.
Yeah, I think that's me. That sounds like a me question. So, kind of two sides to this. So I obviously in marketing, we spend money and we buy tools quite often. So this is something that I have a decent amount of experience with. But typically what I would try to do is avoid being super tactical and in the weeds, especially if you're speaking to like CFO, maybe someone senior level, and try to tie it back to company initiatives or strategic things at the company level. So if a company goal is something around employee retention, for example, or employee engagement, maybe it's you want to retain top talent this year and you have some goals around that. I would try to tie what you're doing back to that versus I want to send a newsletter or I want to do this with this tool. Just really try to bring it up as high level as you can and and this again goes back to communication, but if you know what your company objectives are, then you'll have a much easier time tying it back to that. So, for example, you could say, I want to send newsletters so that we can engage our employees more so they know what's going on, so that they answer our employee surveys more positively. And then that in turn will eventually lead to better retention of our top talent. I think a lot of people that I talk to, even in marketing, tend to default to things like, I want to send a newsletter because this company's doing it, or I want to do this because at my last company we did X. But really trying to figure out what's unique about your company objectives and how you can tie back to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I we've got a few case studies on our website that definitely will help with this. But I also think from our perspective, we're kind of unique in that Appspace isn't just the digital, it's the physical. And I think the customers that we have that tend to show the biggest cost savings. So I mean, very tangible ROI is when they look at consolidating. So if you're using a competitor on digital signage, or you're using a competitor on space reservation, or you're using a competitor on the internet side of things, the customers that save the most are the customers that use for all of it. And of course, it's not just a financial benefit. There's a number of real, for example, we have agentic AI where I can book a desk from my intranet. I can just say book a desk next to Tyler because I haven't seen him in a week and I want to catch up with him, and it can go and do it for me.
Cool.
So I think bringing the worlds together is definitely an obvious ROI, and most customers we speak to tend to be looking at us for more than one thing. But it's less on the softer stuff, more on the harder. Let's save some money across the board. But I think you guys have a nice approach on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen the account execs from, ContactMonkey or Appspace. They're there to help as well, right? So, I mean, whether that's
Mhm.
creating a business case or a deck
Yep.
maybe to take, like they're going to help get you any assets you need to kind of do the heavy lifting for you. But
Mhm.
yeah, all
For sure.
great answers. I guess like on that, with the economy, especially in North America and around the world, elections, tariffs, etc., the way it is right now, we're all in cost saving mode. You kind of touched on that there. Is there a different way that you can position going to budget for this tool? And maybe a two-parter, who should be involved in this budgeting conversation? I think a lot of people don't know,
Mm.
do I go to my boss? Do I go to finance? Is it a human resource tool as well? So maybe if you can touch on both of those things.
Yeah, I think Dave will have a longer answer than me for this one, but I think it really depends if you're starting with no tools or if, to Dave's point, you're starting with, say, a dozen and you're trying to streamline what you're working on. So I would say, assuming that you're starting with not very many tools or close to zero tools, I would first bring in whoever your direct manager or director is, make sure that you have their support and that you get their help. If you're not sure about the company line objectives and how this ties up, that's where your direct manager could definitely help. And also, I think a lot of people are kind of scared to go to finance a lot of the time, but I would bring them in as early as you can. It doesn't have to be the CFO, but just someone on that team so that you can speak the CFO's language and really make the case with them. They'll know more about what the CFO wants to see or hear, depending on who needs sign off. And then for us, I know Dave mentioned this earlier, but depending on who you're selling to, IT often needs to get involved pretty early, depending on what tools you're integrating with. So I would try to poke around at IT too and see who the right person is there.
Yeah, I completely agree. For us, it's multiple stakeholders, particularly on this side of the world. I'd say, yeah, comms and IT, the two no-brainers.
Mhm.
Often HR get thrown in the mix as well, and often comms can fall into HR. But I think on our side of things, we tend not to. It tends to almost be serendipitous that we'll speak to a number of different stakeholders. So we'll be speaking to comms and IT will say, actually, are you speaking to facilities? And facilities need to be involved because, for example, they
Mm,
own the real estate for the screen.
yep.
So I think trying to get them all in a room is very difficult. But again, that idea of the almost serendipitous conversations of, hey, have you spoken to IT? Oh, IT, have you spoken to? And going that way. But yeah, for me, comms and IT have to be in the room. They're
Mm,
the
yeah,
stakeholders for us most of the time.
Amazing. Yeah, getting them on
makes
board
sense.
early rather than, I guess, blindsiding them and it kind of popping up out of nowhere.
Yeah,
Definitely makes sense. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions I'm seeing here. We don't have to go right until the hour. We
great.
can always give some people back, but great conversation today. I'll pass it over to you, Tara and Dave, to sign off, and we'll get the recording and the reports out to everyone, I'm sure.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. So look out for an email from us tomorrow with those reports. You can poke around at that. And like Dave said, we'd love to hear any follow-up questions you might have. We love chatting about this stuff. I could talk about it for much longer. So feel free to send us your questions. And thanks everyone for joining. Thanks again, Dave, for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you. Cheers, guys.